What's up, RPG? Can you hear me okay? Or am I muffled? All right, let me fix where this is located, make it more. There we go. Perfect. Okay, cool. Yeah, it was my mic on the phone was hiding behind something. So awesome. Cool. So just so people know, I am recording this entire thing. It is going to be part of a podcast as well as YouTube series for my dog training and behavior live seminars. And I'll be hosting them free on TikTok, and potentially the next ones I'll be also hosting free on YouTube Live as well. Um, but this is going to be fun. We're going to deep dive stuff. So today it's going to be what are dogs and how do they learn? We're going to deep dive all of the nuances of training terms, how they're applied. We're going to talk about different training methodology from a very unbiased standpoint, just really getting the nitty-gritty, defining things. That's really what's going to be going on here. So I won't be really looking at all the comments throughout this, or I'll lose my train of thought. But hold on to some thoughts and comments because at the end of this, I will be answering questions. So we'll have at least a 15-minute Q&A. If it's a really good Q&A, we might drag that on a little bit longer. So let's go ahead and start getting into this. So, baseline, what are dogs? So, dogs are opportunistic predators and associative learners. And since definitions are super important, let's go ahead and define some stuff, right? So, an opportunistic predator is an animal that changes its strategy or its original aim with certain probability of its encounters that prey certain prop sorry words with a certain probability if it encounters prey that it's not searching for. So layman terms, basically they will change what they do if they encounter prey because of opportunity, right? So they're opportunistic predators. um Dogs are technically still wolves, but they're not pack animals like their modern day wolf cousins. Dogs are social animals, but they don't organize themselves to hunt in packs like modern day wolves do. They can work together with humans and other dogs and other animals to complete tasks, though. But they do not have a certain hierarchy like you would see in wolf packs. So the idea that dogs need to have an alpha leader at the top of a family hierarchy is outdated and incorrect. And using dominance-based training methods on dogs can cause emotional side effects. So let's compare that to the modern day wolf. And I'm going to be very quick with this because, the study of wolves is not really what we're here for today. So modern day wolves, they live in packs that are made up of a breeding pair and their offspring and other family members. And the alpha breeding pair is what controls the allocation of resources. So that's going to be very different than our modern day domesticated dogs. So I also was explaining how they're associative learners. So, associative learning is the process of learning the relationship between two or more stimuli or between a stimulus and a behavior. So, simply put, the dog does a thing, and if it felt good or it got what it wanted, it will keep doing that thing. And if a dog does a thing and it did not feel good and it didn't get what it wanted, it's going to avoid that thing, right? And so, when it comes to learning theory, all animals that are cognitive enough to make decisions learn the exact same way. It's just the application is going to be different. So they learn through classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and social learning, right? And when we train dogs, we're normally going to stick to the classical conditioning and operant conditioning side of things for the most part, because it's the easiest way for us to control the outcome of behavioral changes. And so, what is operant conditioning? That's going to be, especially with new trainers out here. Operant conditioning is going to be primarily what you're mainly going to do, and you're going to kind of dabble in the classical conditioning side of things. Classical conditioning is a little more nuanced. And depending on behavioral changes that you're trying to do, you can end up with a lot more behavioral fallout and unwanted associations and so on created through it if not done right. And we'll get into that soon enough. So operant conditioning it's a learning method that uses reward and punishment to modify behavior. It's also known as instrumental learning, but for the sake of just layman terms that most people in training will hear, we're going to stick with operant conditioning, is what we're going to call it. So you're going to have positive and negative reinforcement, and then you're also going to have positive and negative punishment. So the positive and negative part of the reinforcement and punishment only means to add or remove something, right? Whatever it is you're doing, if you're adding something is positive, and if you're removing something is negative. Now, reinforcement just means to increase a behavior, and punishment just means to reduce a behavior. That's all it is. It's just an equation, right? And depending on how we do things, whatever the outcome of the behavioral changes is going to dictate where we are working within the four quadrants here, right? So an example of positive reinforcement would be you can give your dog a treat when they sit, or you can throw a ball after they bring it back. That's going to basically be increasing a behavior of doing something after we have given them some, and we give them something for it. So that's what increases it. Then we have negative punishment. An example would be you can withhold attention from your dog when your dog jumps up, right? You're removing something to reduce the behavior. Negative reinforcement, a good example would be releasing pressure on a choke chain when your dog complies with a behavior. Uh, a positive punishment would be you can add a bark collar to your dog when they are excessively barking, so that shock right there will reduce the barking every time they bark, right? I'm just giving some extremities, some non-extremities. There's so many more, and I can probably do an hour and a half long, you know, seminar just sticking to examples alone, right? So we're just going to move on from that. I just want to give a few examples for anybody that needed those. So what is classical conditioning, though? Classical conditioning is also known as associative learning. It's a learning process where all organisms, or not all, but an organism associates a neutral stimulus with a response. The process is unconscious and can be used to explain how our environments shape our behaviors, habits, and fears. So within classical conditioning, you're going to hear a lot of words like antecedent, for example. And so I'm going to define it for y'all because antecedent can be confusing to some people, but it's really not. So it's just a stimulus that comes before a behavior and can trigger it, right? So an antecedent can be a learned conditioned stimuli or a neutral unconditioned stimuli, right? So for instance, a car is an antecedent. The word no can be the antecedent. It can be anything that occurs, whether it's an event or an object, uh, before a behavior, and that can trigger it. So in in conditioning, the main goal is to elicit a response, right? So the process involves developing an association between a stimulus and a response without learning any new behaviors. So, for example, if you just like Pavlov did, if you pair a sound of a bell with food, you can condition a dog to salivate when it hears the bell. In that example, the food is the unconditioned stimulus and the bell is the conditioned stimulus, right? And when we work with classical conditioning, again, it is an emotional response. They cannot control it, unlike operant conditioning, that the dog is making a decision based off of their experiences. Um, Cato. So where was I? This is why I don't read comments while I do this. So I'm gonna digress back a little bit. So with classical conditioning, one thing that is very important is when we do the marker, right? The stimuli, the unconditioned stimuli, right? If we do it at the same time Sorry, yeah, if we do it at the same time, the antecedent at the same time as the unconditioned or after the unconditioned stimuli, it will not work. The antecedent has to happen before. It has to happen before, in order for this emotional change to work, or the behavioral response, the uncontrolled behavioral response. Yes, correct. So that's an important thing about that. Again, I'm just going over baseline stuff here, and then in the future seminars, we're going to really deep dive into these to go into a lot more detail. Um, so with that, we're going to go into a little bit of what is a reinforcement marker and a punishment marker, because that actually does go into utilizing classical conditioning when we're using reinforcement and punishment markers. So a reward marker or a reinforcement marker is something that the animal can perceive, such as a sound, sight, touch, etc., that predicts the reinforcer, such as a treat is coming. And so when an animal understands that association, we can use it to mark the behavior that we are trying to train, helping the training to go faster. The same applies with a punishment marker, like the use of the word no, right? Um, and the way we utilize them is by loading the marker. And that's the word you're going to hear a lot of trainers say, loading the marker. Um, yes, RPG, going to leave clarifying comments. Perfect. If I say something that you think needs to be more layman, or you want to clarify something for people in the class right here, go ahead and leave whatever clarifying comments you want to. Absolutely. So, yes, they predict rewards, and punishment markers predict punishment, right? So the way we load a marker, a good example would be clicker training, right? We click, reward, click, reward. Again, classical conditioning. Then eventually you can take that reward away and use the clicker, and it's going to still incite that emotional response that the reward gave them. So that way you can quickly mark a time and space and then follow up with the reward afterwards, so that way you're not fumbling around with a treat, missing that small window of time in order to increase that behavioral changes, or likelihood of the behavior occurring again. Um, and same applies to a punishment marker, but when it comes to ethicalness, right? I will tell everybody here, we do not load punishment markers the same way you would do loading a reinforcement marker. A punishment marker is going to be learned over time through consistency, right? So if you use the word no and then follow up that no with a punishment, then that word no will end up being loaded over the length of time. We're not going to purposely punish a dog just to load a sound or something to create a punishment marker. That's just not okay at all. Don't do that. So why is punishment, sorry, I lied. Why is positive reinforcement training so effective? It's so effective because studies have shown that when trying to increase behaviors, and the likelihood of behaviors happening and creating new behaviors, it is statistically better than everything else for the majority of dogs. Every dog, not necessarily. But this really applies a lot to puppies, a hell of a lot to puppies. But it does also apply to adult dogs too. Um, so it's all about motivation versus motivators. We'll get into that further in the future. But within positive reinforcement, you're going to have different techniques, right? So one is going to be capturing. So this technique involves waiting for your dog to perform a natural behavior, such as like sitting, yawning, or stretching, or barking, and then we reinforce it. So capturing is the effect for reinforcing natural behaviors, and they can be used to teach behaviors that might be difficult to teach with luring. And so now we got to know what luring is, right? Um, so luring is a technique that involves using treats, toys, or a hand to guide your dog into a desired position. So luring is effective for basic obedience training, such as teaching your dog to sit, stay, to come. It's a quick way to get a desired behavior and can create new brain neuron connections, right? So, however, the lure needs to be removed early in the training process, and we'll get to that here shortly as well. Then you have shaping. Shaping is a technique that involves marking and rewarding your dog for approximations of desired behavior until they understand what's expected of them. So, shaping is effective for teaching complex behaviors. And then within this, you have different things like jackpot methods, right? So the term jackpot that you'll hear a lot of people use in dog training is it's a term used to describe a larger or more valuable reward given to a dog for exceptional performance or when they surpass expectations, right? It provides an extra level of motivation and reinforcement. So jackpots are primarily used when a dog accomplishes a new skill for the first time or finally overcame a behavior they've been struggling with. But you can also use it at random as well throughout obedience training, to where the dog is doing the behaviors because they're expecting that jackpot to happen at some point, right? But what we don't want to do is bribe the dog. There is going to be bribery at the beginning, but this is where the whole fading the lure is going to come in, which is a technique used in training where a visual or physical prompt, like the lure, is gradually reduced or faded to encourage the dog to perform the behavior independently without relying on the the prompt or the reward, right? So if we continuously always have to show our dogs a treat or a toy for them to do a task, then we're continuously bribing the dog, and then the dog is never actually doing the stuff that we ask it to do in anticipation to potentially and eventually get rewarded, right? So that's why we want to fade the lure so that we're not continuously bribing the dog. So another thing that you'll hear a lot about is when we are changing commands, right? And I'm not talking about changing commands saying sit and then following it up with a lay down and a stay and implied stay and so on, right? I'm talking about changing commands to where it's a sit and a sit down and a lay down and a lay and a down all means the same thing. We want to try to keep the commands as small as possible. And we can eventually teach more and more commands. But if we're teaching a new behavior, when we keep changing the consistency of the commands we're using, it's going to confuse the dog and it's going to make training a lot more difficult for you in the long run. So, since we are talking about operant conditioning at this point and training, we also need to talk about punishments and aversives. So, what is aversive, right? Aversive is just causing a strong dislike or discomfort to an animal, right? I.e., a shock collar, vibrate, or beep, or shock, right? All three of those things can be aversive to a dog. I'm actually at the end of this Celsius. I am going to be going over the different training methods that people use like Nipopo, Lima, and so on, and we'll get into that eventually. Um so so what was I saying? So yeah, so not all dogs are going to find everything aversive that other dogs might find aversive. So it's up to the dog to decide what is aversive and what's rewarding, right? But all an aversive is something that causes a strong dislike or discomfort to the dog, right? And so that's where we get into the correction and punishment debate, right? So a lot of people say it's correction, not punishment. A lot of people don't like the word punishment because they assume it means corporal punishment, hitting the dog. And again, as we explained already, punishment and learning theory and the science-based learning theory only means to reduce behavior. So in corrections, what's normally defined as is a correction is a way to provide feedback to a dog to help them learn. Corrections are different from punishment, is what most people will say, which because punishment implies that a dog intentionally disobeyed a command. But again, that's because we're making implications that are not based on the scientific learning theory. So punishment is anything to reduce a behavior intentionally or unintentionally. If the dog is intentionally or unintentionally doing an unwanted behavior. So so yeah, so that's a big difference between the two. But in my personal opinion is that if we're going to use the word correction, correction doesn't necessarily have to reduce a behavior. Uh Yeah, as in the comments, RPG said, correction provides feedback. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a punishment to be a correction. So how do we use punishment and when do we use punishment, right? Um, it's used exactly the same way as reinforcement is used. There's a certain time window to utilize a punishment, or it's not going to communicate with the dog, and then you might be reducing other behaviors because the dog has already moved past what it has already done, right? And when do we use it? We use it whenever we want to reduce a behavior. It's just that simple. So a good example that I see all the time is that people will come home from work, for instance. Let's say the dog is not in a crate and it gets in the trash, or it gets and it tears up the sofa or something like that. Uh, they will punish their dog. That's hours after it happened. The dog is going to be confused. The dog will not put two and two together. They don't generalize very well with that extended amount of time in between, and so that's can be very dangerous to do in the grand scheme of things when it comes to your dog's psychological well-being. And when it comes to punishments, we have to bring up other terminologies that you're going to hear, like learned helplessness. So learned helplessness is a psychological condition in which an animal, after experiencing repeated unavoidable or uncontrollable aversive events, learns to become passive or helpless in subsequent situations. So even when escape or avoidance is possible, is characterized by a perceived lack of control or agency over that animal's environment. So the person that actually coined the learned helplessness term was doing a study where they had a dog or multiple dogs. They tried this on. Where they had the dog with a floor that was being shocked very heavily, consistently, and the dog couldn't escape or do anything. And then when they removed those barriers eventually, um, and allowed a little fencing to where the dog can jump over it, the dog still didn't jump over it when it was being shocked because of the learned helplessness. Um, so there are some examples of training methods that can lead to learned helplessness in dogs. And some of these are not that extreme. Some of them are, right? And again, we don't get to decide what's aversive to the dog. The dog does. So here's some examples. Sitting next to a scared dog's crate, feeding a scared dog only by hand, um, walking a dog through crowded events on a leash, taking a dog to a training class where it's kept on a leash in close proximity to other dogs, bringing a dog to an enclosed dog park where another dog is bullying that dog. Um, those are some examples. And the reason why I brought those examples up instead of saying, using the e-collar to shock a dog into submission is because a lot of people don't realize that learned helplessness does not always include aversive tools, right? Um, it always includes aversiveness, but again, I'll repeat it. We don't get to decide what's aversive to a dog. The dog does, right? So other things we have is for instance learned irrelevance. So learned irrelevance refers to a phenomenon in which an animal learns to disregard or perceive a previously relevant stimulus as irrelevant or unrelated to the occurrence of certain behaviors or consequences. So it occurs when a stimulus consistently fails to predict or affect the outcome of a behavior. To make it easier to digest. Lack of rewards is a good example. So if a dog is given a treat for a desired behavior, but then the treat is no longer given, the dog will eventually learn that the behavior is no longer rewarded. Overuse of a cue is another good example. Like if a cue is used all the time without leading to anything important, the dog will learn to ignore it. For example, if a dog owner frequently calls their dog come, right? Before actually training them to come, the dog will learn that the word has zero meaning at all. Um, and then, and once the cue has become irrelevant, it's extremely difficult to give it meaning again. So if a dog has learned to come, and that, sorry, has learned that come has no meaning, it's easier to train them to come with a new cue than using the word come. Sorry, just reading through a couple comments. Again, thank you, RPG. I really appreciate it. So, when it comes to training, utilizing operant conditioning or classical conditioning, consistency and timing are going to be some of the most key components within your training, right? So you have to be consistent, and everybody within the household needs to be consistent too. And it gets very difficult when you have multiple human households and they see dog training or they see the dog differently, treat the dog differently, things are not consistent, and then we wonder why the dog is not learning. It's because of the lack of consistency. If the dog jumps up on me and I give the dog pets when they jump up on me, so I'm rewarding the pets, but my wife doesn't allow it, why is the dog still jumping up? It's because I'm not being consistent with what my wife is trying to do. And then when it comes to timing, timing is extremely important too. You have a very, very small window to time a reward or a punishment to the behavior that we're trying to increase or decrease, right? And if we don't time it appropriately, and let's say we miss the point of time that is allowed for the dog to actually put the two things together, right? Associate them. You can easily create accidental conditioning by rewarding or punishing a different behavior, where the dog perceives it. Um, your reward or punishment towards that behavior that they've already moved past the original one. So so timing again is extremely important. And as a professional dog trainer, that is something when I'm working with dogs and dog owners on any capacity. One of the biggest things I work on is I work on their handling skills to make sure that their timing is top tier. For them to be successful when I'm not around, they need to be able to time things appropriately. And they have to be consistent. So accidental conditioning. I was just discussing that. So I want to give a couple examples because accidental conditioning is exactly how it sounds. We accidentally condition a behavior. The easy example to give is when you come home from work or school, we're excited to see our dogs, and our dogs love us and excited. The dog jumps up to see us and give us licks and enjoy our presence and affection. And we immediately get down and start petting them, let them lick our face and stuff. Every single bit of that is super rewarding to those dogs that are doing that, right? And because it's super rewarding, we are reinforcing that behavior. And if we continue reinforcing that behavior while trying to also punish that behavior, and that behavior just does not go away, it's because we're continuing to reinforce that behavior and we're likely confusing the dog with the punishment as well. Right. Um, but there's also self-reinforced behaviors. So self-reinforced behaviors is behaviors that are reinforced by the dog with no human component involved. A good example of self-reinforced behaviors is a dog barking and lunging at the window. The dog may have seen another dog walk by, or may have seen another person walk by, and maybe the dog just doesn't want them to be in that space, right? So they barked one time, right? They just barked. And then that person or dog continues to walk by, just ignoring them. In the dog's head, they're like, yeah, I did that, right? They reinforce that behavior, so they're likely to do it again, right? And there are so many behaviors where they are accidentally conditioned. And the environment will continuously condition the dog. And so when it comes to our training, environmental factors are extremely important to look at on why our dogs are doing certain things. And so even with I said accidental conditioning, I meant to say self-reinforcing reinforcement of behaviors earlier with the window example when I said accidental. So I apologize about that. And then another one that you'll hear me say a lot of is superstitious associations. You're not going to hear this from a lot of dog trainers, but it is a thing, and it is a real term. So superstitious associations, just like self-reinforced behavior, just like accidental conditioning, it's exactly as it sounds. It's a superstitious association. So it's a belief that certain events or objects, like the antecedents, are linked to unrelated events or objects, right? So an example would be your dog, and I've had this example and we've worked through this. A dog is afraid of cars because it's only been on 3 car rides in its entire life, and it always ended with going to the vet and getting a shot, right? Or a dog is afraid with people that wear hats because one day it looked at a person that was wearing a hat and then somebody slammed a trash can lid and then it associated those two things together, right? Those are superstitious associations, and from my anecdotal experience with a very large data pool, um, superstitious associations are probably the easiest behavioral issues to work through, right? And there's a lot of ways to work through it. So you can work through it through flooding, counter conditioning, extinction, and so on. And I'm going to go through these right now to explain what they are. So flooding. Flooding is it's a controversial dog training technique that involves exposing a dog to a feared stimulus with without the ability to escape, right? And so the goal in flooding is to eliminate a dog's fear or anxiety response by forcing them to confront their fears. The method is to expose the dog to high levels of the feared stimulus for a period of time. And the purpose is just to break the dog's fear and emotional barrier. So flooding is normally not recommended because of its potential negative consequences and the availability of, other, effective and potentially more humane alternatives. So some people say that flooding can make a dog's feelings and behavior stronger, such as aggression, deeper fear, and anxiety. Others say that it can be hard to know if the dog is calm or shut down. So it's super important to understand canine body language to a very, very, very high level if we are to use a technique like that. And I do not suggest it for pretty much almost everybody. It's a very small 1% of professionals out there that I could say can do it properly. Um, Now we have counter conditioning. Counter conditioning pairs a negative stimulus with a positive stimulus to create new desired responses. So, an example is if your dog is afraid of cars, you can give them a treat each time a car passes by. Counter conditioning is often used in combination with desensitization, which, unlike flooding, desensitization is a process of gradually exposing the dog to the stimulus, right? So when we're working through things, I much prefer, especially like I was talking about with the superstitious associations, desensitization is going to be a lot more effective for most people because it's easier to do it appropriately. Um, so extinction of a behavior and extinction bursts. So behavioral extinction is a psychological process that involves reducing or eliminating a learned behavior by withholding the reinforcement that previously maintained it, right? So pretty much the behavior stops working because it no longer works to achieve the goal the dog had in mind, right? A dog is consistently lunging at me. Most people will back away, reinforcing the behavior. If I no longer back away and the behavior doesn't work anymore, it starts the extinction process, right? But then we have extinction bursts. So an extinction burst is when a reinforcer is removed too soon or too suddenly. The behavior may increase in frequency and magnitude. So basically it's kind of like a last ditch effort of the dog to maintain that control it had of making that behavior work, right? You also have spontaneous recovery, which it's a behavior that has shown extinction. It might suddenly reoccur again. Um, Continued reinforcement is important. Reinforcing a behavior all the time or on a schedule can reduce the chance of extinction, right? So that's where consistency comes in, right? Again, it always is going to circle. If we look at every single thing I'm talking about here, it will always circle back to consistency and timing, right? And then so the applications of extinction plays a significant role in classical and operant conditioning. It works through both of those learning theory models. Great. So just to let everybody know, I am recording everything on this phone screen as well, and that is actually going to be on the YouTube podcast as well as videos. So that way people can actually see all the comments coming through. So RPG, all your comments are going to be popping through as we go through this. So that's awesome. Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. All right, so let's talk about environmental exposure and socialization because these are very, very, very key when it comes to our dogs, especially younger dogs, um, growth and how they perceive the world around them, and then their behaviors. So, proper socialization, or at least socialization, is the process of introducing a dog to new people, places, situations, to help them feel comfortable and confident, right? So the goal of socialization is to help your dog learn how to interact with others and to explore the world around them in a safe and positive way. And then we have environmental exposure. So environmental exposure is a little different than socialization because it's just where a dog in the training process is exposed to a variety of new sights, sounds, smells, surfaces, and situations, right? So that's an important part of the actual socialization process, and it can help them learn to deal with the world around them, right? And so what I like to do is combine those two and utilize environmental socialization, right? So that way we are not gambling that other dogs and other people are going to be doing things right or wrong. It's very controlled, and it's completely okay to work on proper socialization from a distance. Not everybody has to meet the dog. Not every dog has to meet the dog, right? So by being able to exist in the space with environmental socialization, can capitalize on both environmental exposure and the proper socialization. So play is also going to be a super important part of your dog's development and can help shape their behavior in many, many ways. So it shapes their behavior with social skills. It helps puppies learn how to communicate, interact with other dogs, and follow social rules. Puppies learn how to use their mouths without causing harm through play, which helps with the bite inhibition. Um, it helps dogs develop motor skills. It helps dogs develop confidence. It helps dogs develop self-control. Play can help dogs learn how to resolve conflicts. Play can strengthen the bond between a dog and their owner. And play can be used as a reinforcing consequence for training, right? For example, you can mark good behavior with a click or a yes, and then engage with play as the reinforcement instead of just a treat, right? So we also have, again, this one I'm just going touching base on everything, and then the next ones that we do, I'm going to be doing these once a week. It's going to be on Saturdays instead of Sundays going forward. Um, but we're going to start deep diving all of these topics in each one as we go, correct? Or all right. Correct. Correct, guys. All right. So behavioral fallout. Behavioral fallout refers to the unintended consequence or side effects that may occur as a result of modifying a particular behavior. Um, I think, did I already discuss behavioral fallout? Let me look at my notes. Bear with me for just a second, y'all. No, we talked learned helplessness. I Let's go back. So we're going to talk behavior fallout. So yeah, again, it refers to the unintended consequences or side effects that may occur as a result of modifying our particular behavior. So it involves the emergence of new behaviors or changes in existing behaviors that were not directly targeted or anticipated during the behavior modification process. So a common example is the fear a dog may develop towards their handlers when being trained using compulsion, right? But compulsion training and use of aversives and things like that is not the only thing that can create behavioral fallout. Reward-based training is not exempt at all from this. So, examples of behavioral fallout that can be caused by certain reward-based training is like separation anxiety and excessive barking, for instance, right? So just remember that behavioral fallout does not necessarily mean behavioral fallout due to aversives or compulsion. Behavioral fallout just means that there are new behaviors or changing in existing behaviors that were not directly targeted or anticipated during our training process. So we did talk about desensitization. I just want to touch base on it to define it a little bit better. It's a process used to reduce or eliminate an animal's fear or phobias by gradually exposing it to the feared stimulus or situation in a controlled or systematic manner, right? It involves progressively increasing the intensity or the proximity of the stimulus while ensuring the animal remains relaxed or comfortable. So we also have differential reinforcement. Differential reinforcement is a it's a training technique that involves reinforcing specific behaviors while ignoring or redirecting other behaviors or and it aims to increase the frequency of the desired behavior and decrease the unwanted behavior. It also refers to the use of varying values of reinforcers to reward varying degrees of proficiency. So the greater the proficiency, the higher the reward value. So then we have other things like engagement. You're going to hear a lot about that throughout different training, and any trainer out there, doesn't matter what methodology you're going to use, you can be on any extreme of the ideologies of your or what you prescribe to as your methods. Engagement is always going to be something that you're focusing on, right? So the four stages of learning in dog training refers to the sequential process. So you have acquisition where the dog learns the behavior. You have fluency when the behavior is reinforced. You have generalization where the dog applies the behavior to different contexts. And then you have maintenance where the behavior is maintained over time. So those are the four stages of learning and dog training. Again, we'll touch base on that even further in another seminar. Uh, did I just really skip over engagement completely? I just like said a sentence and then just skipped over like deep diving it. So engagement is engagement. It's where your dog its focus is on its handler or its focus is on a toy or a different stimulus, an antecedent. It's just the dog engaging with something, right? And if we can have the dog engaging in what we want it to engage with, then its focus is not on all the other stimuli around it, making our training a whole lot easier and also reducing the potential of unwanted behaviors occurring due to self-reinforced behaviors, right? So, examples would be if I am walking a dog and that dog continuously checks in on me, right? I can use reward markers, or just reward-based training to mark the check-in. Every time the dog looks at me, I just pop a treat. Don't even have to say anything. I just pop a treat. The dog will start looking at me, expecting a treat, right? Engagement. If the dog is engaging with me and checking in with me, it's not paying attention to its surroundings, then it's less likely that it's going to want to focus on that cat or squirrel walking by and then go chase and lunge at it, right? So engagement can really, really help a lot of things. And it's not just you're engaging with me so we can get through this training session, right? It's across the board. Engagement is awesome. So, so we did talk about the four stages of learning and dog training. I'm just going to skip through that right now because we already discussed it on a basic level. Let's talk about management. So, in the context of animal behavior, management refers to strategic control and manipulation of the animal's environment or conditions to prevent or minimize problem behaviors, um, to promote positive behaviors, and to ensure the well-being and safety of the animal, right? So it involves implementing effective routines, structures, and environmental modifications, right? Management is a valuable, valuable tool, right? And I'm calling it a tool because that's exactly what it is. It's something we implement. So do we have to manage everything in dog training? No, not necessarily. But there are certain things that we are going to have to manage. And it's going to be dog and dog dependent, behavior and behavior dependent, and your own capabilities dependent, and the environment around it dependent. So management, I think is awesome. I think you should manage. I don't think that every single thing in the dog's world should have to be managed. That's where all these other training techniques come in. But utilize management when it's necessary, for sure. So when we're using cues, I could have put this a little bit earlier up in this, but when we're using cues, and a cue would be like a command, right? Sit, stay, lay down. Or even your markers can be cues, right? Um, you can poison the cue, and you'll hear dog trainers sometimes say poisoning a cue, right? So it's a term that's used to describe unintentionally associating a previously learned cue with a negative outcome or punishment, leading the dog to develop a negative association with the cue. So a cue can also become poisoned if used repeatedly without resulting in the desired behavior. So this leads to the cue losing meaning to the dog. This is exactly why people tell you all the time, don't keep repeating commands. If I tell the dog to sit, I don't say sit, 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 sit. I don't keep repeating it, right? Because that's going to poison the cue. I tell the dog once, I wait for the dog to make a decision, and then I either reinforce the behavior or I create a punishment or a negative reinforcement, negative punishment, whatever I need to do to make sure that the dog does the behavior. Or if I need to repeat the command, if the dog's going to blow it off, I'm going to wait an extended period of time, reset the dog, and then I'm going to use the cue again, right? I don't want to poison that cue. So another another aspect about training, again, could have been up when we were talking about operant conditioning, is spatial pressure, right? So spatial pressure is a technique where the trainer uses their body position, movement, or proximity to influence a dog's behavior or movement, right? So spatial pressure can be used to encourage a dog to move in a desired direction or create space boundaries. It can be considered a form of intimidation. And if a dog is not properly acclimated to the pressure, it will act as an aversive. So keep that in mind. So we can actually get into that further when we're talking about like positive reinforcement training versus other types of training. Spatial pressure is part of positive reinforcement training, and again, we don't get to decide what's aversive. The dog does, right? Um, and that becomes kind of contradictual within that. But I'm not going to go here in a very biased mindset towards positive reinforcement training or compulsion training or anything in between. I want to just be matter of fact for everybody, so that way you can understand all the nuances and intricacies between everything, and then you can make a decision for yourself on what you want to prescribe to. So another thing that you're going to hear trainers talk a lot about, and people everywhere, you're going to hear this fear period. What is a fear period, right? Fear period, it just refers to a specific developmental stage in some animals, particularly dogs, during which they exhibit heightened sensitivity, fearfulness, or reactivity to new unfamiliar stimuli, right? Simply put, is puberty. Like that is as simple as it can make it. Chemicals are changing. They're going through puberty, right? That's really what it is. And throughout the fear period, it doesn't always necessarily mean that the dog is going to have the heightened sensitivity or fearfulness or reactivity. The dog might have a stubborn streak, for instance, and start blowing off all the commands because they want to be more independent. The dog might start becoming more of a bully to other animals and start losing impulse control. There's a lot of things that can happen during this fear period because it's not necessarily fear based. So we've gone through a huge baseline of definitions and discussing them a little further within dog trainings, but I want to talk a little bit right now about the types of dog training methods, right? Um, I'm not going to go through every single one, but I'm going to talk about the main four, add an extra fifth one because I hear it quite often, right? And then there's going to be little niches between them that actually expand them to other training methods as well. So I'm going to start on one side of the spectrum and work all the way through to the other side of the spectrum, right? You have R plus training, which is positive reinforcement training. You have Lima, you have balance training, you have knee popo, and compulsion training, right? Those are going to be the five main ones that you're going to hear most of the time. R plus training can be kind of switched between R plus and force free, but we'll get into that here right now, actually. So R plus or positive reinforcement training is used to describe a dog trainer's method or style of training where the trainers identify the trainers that words. Let me think for a second. The trainers that identify as positive reinforcement use rewards like food, attention, or play to motivate a dog to perform a particular behavior. An R plus approach uh, to coming when called, for example, means the dog receives a treat for coming inside and away from the hole that they were investigating in the yard, right? So positive reinforcement is said to be a way to train dogs and create strong relationships based on understanding rather than force or punishment. And that's where the idea of force free comes from, is not necessarily never using force. It's because the approach is based on understanding rather than force or punishment, right? Um, so I I am definitely guilty of this, y'all, where I will say force free as an example. That's just a buzzword, right? Um, there are laws and stuff like leash laws and shit. Like even if somebody wants to be completely off leash, completely literally force free, they can't do it. Right? It's illegal most places, and they're gonna have to stick by that. And most people that are R plus positive reinforcement trainers are completely okay with the utilization of force in extreme and dangerous events, right? So you have to remember that as well. There is definitely very high level places in the world of dog training for R plus training. It should definitely be one of the main go-tos for any type of obedience training, and learning new behaviors. Definitely anybody of any training methodology, doesn't matter compulsion or Lima or whatever else, right? Should definitely have a strong understanding of R plus training, no matter what, right? Cooperative care is going to be something that you're going to hear a lot of whenever it comes to the positive reinforcement trainers approach. And cooperative care is a type of training that involves. Sorry, I have a nose itch. It's a type of training that involves teaching a dog to actively participate in their own care, such as like grooming, handling, veterinarian procedures, things like that. So rather than simply tolerating the procedures, the dogs are trained for a cooperative care to learn to happily participate in them, right? And the way you're going to do that is through positive reinforcement training. So next on the list we have Lima. Lima is an acronym. It's for least intrusive, minimally aversive, and it's a dog training philosophy that focuses on using positive reinforcement to teach dogs desired behavior. So Lena training aims to build a strong bond, foster a positive relationship between the dog and their owner, promote the well-being, and avoid methods that could cause fear, aggression, or physical injury. Use humane methods, like prioritize the least intrusive and minimally aversive methods available, right? So, for instance, if they know that they can do this method with positive reinforcement approach, they're not going to go to a punishment approach with like a prong collar, for instance, when they can do it some ways that's less aversive or less intrusive than that, right? And so yeah, they're trying to avoid punishment with that. Doesn't mean that they're not going to use it. It just means that they're going to try to avoid it if it deems applicable, right? So the avoided use of punishment or physical force, like e-collars, choke chains, and stuff like that, right? Um, so there's also another one that actually I was learning about the other day that I will eventually touch more base on. Is called life, right? It's very similar to the Lima approach, but it gets more broad. So that way there's more definitive terms on what they are aiming for when it comes to least intrusive and minimally aversive type approaches, right? So I would definitely look into life, but I will be going over the life training methods soon enough. So then we have, sorry about that. 1 second. I'm going to take a 1 minute break real quick and get those birds to stop yelling at me. Here you guys go. Okay. Budgies are funny, man. Self-reinforced behavior. They yell at me, and it's because they want me to shake up their food so that way the newer food is on top. It's pretty funny. Nonetheless, all right, so we just said Lima. The next one on the list, going down the spectrum from one side to the other, would be balanced dog training. So balanced dog training teaches a dog desired behaviors using both reward-based techniques and they try to use fair corrections or punishments which the dog will be introduced to once it associates the behavior with a command, right? Um, it's going when it at least when it comes to the obedience side of it, right? So the intent of the correction the intent to of the correction to change the dog's behavior is to deliver just enough information to understand that the choices they make will either result in a reward or a punishment, right? So in circumstances when the punishment is required, the dog is supposed to understand why it happened and can learn to avoid the same situation in the future. So, simply put, balanced dog trainers are going to utilize every single tool in their tool belt. So, any training style that's out there, they might pull from, and they're not afraid to use tools. Not afraid to use positive reinforcement training. Again, anecdotal experience with a very large data pool. What I have found is that when it comes to balanced trainers, you are going to see there's going to be there's still going to be the outliers in the middle, but there's going to be a pretty big split between how they approach it. And you're going to find a lot of balanced trainers that lean towards more Lima and positive reinforcement training. You're going to find a lot of balanced trainers that lean with more of a compulsion training in the mix, right? But you'll also find that the balanced trainers' decisions on what they're leaning towards most of the time is normally dictated by what niche of dogs they're normally working with. Is something that I have seen. Then we have knee popo, right? Knee popo is a trademarked name for a training method. Comes from the negative positive training system that allows the handler to take advantage of the benefits of both positive reinforcement training and negative reinforcement training. So sometimes it's called avoidance training. And and so, yeah, they utilize positive punishment, positive reinforcement, and negative reinforcement to basically have the dog avoid doing or avoid the stimuli, whether it's the punishment stimuli or the negative reinforcement stimuli, and then follow it up with the positive reinforcement. When it comes to Nipopo, they do a lot of work at the beginning in obedience with the positive reinforcement side of things. Oh no, what's going on here? Oh, I have okay. Let me try it again. I have the puzzle piece, y'all. Give me a second. Cool. All right. I had to do the puzzle piece. So in Nipopo, at the beginning, they usually, I'm not gonna say every time, but they usually are going to be utilizing the positive reinforcement obedience training because the idea is to have the dog first understand what is expected out of them. Like a sit means a sit, right? And then they use Nipopo to solidify that there is no getting out of it. When I say to sit, you're gonna sit. Avoidance training, right? So that's how that's applied. And then we have on the other end of the spectrum from positive reinforcement, the whole other end, you're gonna have compulsion dog training, right? So compulsion dog training is a dog training method that uses punishment and negative reinforcement primarily to teach a dog that it must comply with commands, right? Compulsion training is going to get a lot of controversy and a lot of backlash because compulsion training is one of the easiest methods to abuse, um, because of just the types of things we do in compulsion training, right? And so I'm not going to say compulsion is right or wrong because even myself and many, many other people have used compulsion methods when it's necessary, right? And compulsion methods don't necessarily have to be extreme, uh, but they are still compulsion where the dog must comply with commands. Uh, so those are going to be the main training methods that you are going to be seeing and hearing about. And we are going to deep dive those in one of the next seminars as well. So that way we go into very, very heavy detail because I want anybody listening in to be able to make their own decisions rather than my own biased ideals on how dogs should be trained. Right? Because just because I say something doesn't make me right or wrong. Just because somebody else disagrees doesn't make me wrong. Just because I disagree with somebody else doesn't make them wrong. Right? Um, Dog training is a science, but it's also an art form. And so we gotta, take it with that and figure out what we want to do with it, right? And how does our dog respond to it? But with that said, that's all I got today with the first seminar of this dog training and behavior lives. And I am open to any Q&A anybody has. I'll answer any questions for a little while. Feel free to comment. Right, RPG? Perfect hour, 10 out of 10. Yes. I I did some work ahead of time to make sure that I had enough time for an hour seminar. It's not my first seminar. I've done quite a few public seminars. So I'm pretty good at figuring out how much is going to be allocated within the time. So, does anybody have any questions? I know RPG dog training in the comments cleared up a lot of stuff, put a lot of things in layman terms. I am glad to answer anything. I did see somebody earlier, if you're still in the live, um, somebody earlier asked me what my opinion of knee popo. Um, I don't really have any biased opinion on knee popo. I feel knee popo is a form of balance training. It just goes into a more compulsion side extreme of balance training. All right, so let's see. Dan, who dictates what is reinforcing versus what is consequence aversive? Science, the human, or the dog? The dog does. The dog gets to dictate what it feels is reinforcing and what it feels is a consequence or aversive, right? And now to even piggyback further off of that, we don't get to dictate what quadrant of operant conditioning we're using. It's the behavioral changes, the outcome of the behavioral changes that dictate that. Yeah, and I'm willing to have some people up in the panels too. Yeah, if anybody wants to verbally have conversation or questions. Let's see. Do you have any tips? Did you say something before that? It might have I didn't see your question on the tips. I have plenty of tips. I just don't know what tips you need. And just to let everybody know that this is recorded, because this entire seminar that I have is going on the podcasts on different platforms, as well as it's going to go under my YouTube channel, when in its own seminar files. So we'll be doing this once a week. It's going to be instead of Sundays, it will be every Saturday around 5 o'clock is what I'm going to try to do. If it changes for whatever reason, I'll throw up a TikTok letting you guys know that I have a late day and it's going to be later that day, with work. But I'm trying to set my Saturdays aside for group training sessions, setting up all my content for the next week, and then seminar.
Um, when you're looking at different kinds of training methodologies and like what's going to apply, because right, you choose different methodologies for different things that you're training. What is one quick thing that you tell your clients to help them evaluate, should I use positive reinforcement? Should I use negative reinforcement in this situation?
What's a quick thing I tell my clients? Well, first off, as the trainer, I probably already know what my clients' capabilities are when it comes to their handling skills. So when my clients do ask me personally that, I'm probably going to give them the answer that's going to give them the most reliable results based on their own handling skills, right? So usually, like if a client says, "Should I be using negative reinforcement here or positive reinforcement here?" Um, I what is my client good at doing that's going to get the best results, right? But again, it also depends on what we're trying to do. Like for instance, like there's a very big difference between positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, right? Am I applying pressure on something, and then not removing the pressure until the dog does the desired behavior, or am I trying to use a reward to allow the dog to do the desired behavior and reward it, right? So, I mean, it really depends. I don't think that there's a really simple answer to that. I think experience in my case is going to dictate how I explain it or tell my clients. But as a layman person, it's really until you have enough experience, think about what behavioral change you're trying to do, whether reduce or increase a behavior. And are you trying to take something away to do it or add something to do it? Right? You don't have to necessarily know all these terms in order to apply appropriate dog training. Yes, House of Hounds, evaluating the dog is definitely something that is important as well when it comes to that. And environments, right? And the owner's prescription to their own moral compass and so on. There's so many nuances, for sure. How's it going, Dan? How are you?
Hey, what's up, man?
It's going. So the person in the comments, unfortunately, the tip I have to give you to deal with your dog's reactivity, more of excitement than aggression. Um, unfortunately, I when you say reactivity, I don't know how you're referring it, the behaviors that you're explaining and seeing. So it's hard for me to really give you any advice here because I could give you the wrong advice to make it worse. And my best advice is to go hire a trainer. But if it actually is truly the dog is just getting excited, and the reactivity is not aggression based, it's just like the dog's just being excited, right? Then work on neutrality, work on exposure, work on basically turning everything into pieces of furniture, right? Awesome. Any other questions? Let's see. I did see somebody else wanted up, but it looks like they stopped from wanting up. Yeah, that was fun. It's been a
I'm impressed. You went a little bit fast in some areas for me to be able to interpret and type notes at the same time, but I can never get done on time. Like, timing is my worst enemy, so I give you 10 thumbs up for that.
10 thumbs up for keeping it within that hour. Awesome. Well, with that said, does anybody have any comments and stuff? So right now I'm kind of putting these episodes together or seminars together, kind of case by or not case by case, but like seminar by seminar. And so I figure the first one is basically let's just go over all the fucking definitions, right? And so that's pretty much what this was. Just very quick, go through all the definitions that you're gonna hear dog trainers use and kind of how they apply in various different ways. The next seminar, I'm thinking about the next few seminars just sticking to a specific thing like positive reinforcement and just deep dive that. Um, Punishments, deep dive that on a different seminar and so on. What are your thoughts?
I like it. I think you might have a little bit better. I'm trying to find the word. I lost it. Okay, right now, kind of like the way you're explaining things is very towards baby trainers.
That's
It,
that's how this first one was. I think that's what I want to do is go
okay.
towards baby trainers at first, and then as I continue, because I don't want this to ever end. I want literally every single week to be able to do one of these, and so I want to start at the beginning here, and then as we continue, it just gets more and more and more and more advanced. And then anybody that's tuning into the more advanced ones, like I don't know what you're talking about, I can refer them back to all of the episodes that are free and available for them to go and just kind of just binge listen to or watch.
That
That's
sounds perfect.
yeah, that's my
My
thought.
brain was. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no. Go ahead. I just said that's just my thought process on how to do this.
My brain was thinking that you were targeting it more towards like owners, less than trainers. So I wanted to make sure that your target audience was what you were
Yep, my target
targeting.
audience at the beginning is definitely owners and baby trainers, and then it's slowly going to get into very advanced stuff. But I also want to try to get at it with a very unbiased standpoint. That's why if you notice when I was talking about like positive reinforcement training and compulsion training stuff, I'm not saying anything poor about it. I'm just kind of matter of fact because I want people to make their own decisions. Oh,
All
that's
right, my dog nuisance. Today's the first time I've let all three of them out at the same time
Mhm.
in my bedroom in a long time.
Yeah. Yeah, so give me a second, y'all. I'm gonna stay on live. But I'm going to stop the actual recording that I have going on. So give me just a second. So thank you guys for listening in, and we cannot wait to see everyone on our next seminar. Take care.